Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be focusing on Chapter 16, all about urban problems. Here's a summary overview of the chapter. Cities existed well before the Industrial Revolution. However, it was the birth of the factory system that led to rapid urbanization. As cities grew, many middle class families moved to the suburbs, changing the composition of cities. Suburban infrastructure tends to be in better condition when compared to central cities. U.S. cities are facing a fiscal crisis. Taxpayers have moved out of the city's taxing authority, while the need for services has grown. Problems with healthcare and a shortage of affordable housing have led to an increase in the homeless population. Racial and ethnic segregation continues to be a problem for many people. Cities in other nations are facing growth problems as well. Most of the world's population will live in urban areas. Global patterns of urbanization differ among core, semi peripheral, and peripheral nations. Functionalists and conflict theorists offer different explanations of urban city growth and problems. Symbolic interactionists examine how people experience the city. By the time you're done reading Chapter 16, reviewing the Chapter 16 PowerPoint, and watching this video, you'll be able to describe the growth of cities and urban areas in the United States, identify significant problems occurring in urban America, describe the shifts that have occurred in urban populations, the growth of urban algorithms, and the problems that they face, and finally discuss functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist approaches for addressing urban problems. What we see here is an example of a city slum that is becoming a global problem in urban areas. Industrialization and urbanization bring about profound changes in society and frequently spawn new social problems, such as housing shortages, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, pollution, and crime. According to sociologists, a city is a relatively dense and permanent settlement of people who secure their livelihood through non agricultural activities. Though cities existed long before the Industrial Revolution, the birth of the factory system brought about rapid urbanization. Early cities were a composite of commercial, residential, and manufacturing activities located in close proximity. With the introduction of streetcar lines in the mid to late 1800s, people were able to move easily from place to place within a city and to commute between the core city and the outlying suburban areas. As a result, many middle class families moved out of the central areas. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, improved transportation and new technologies for supplying water and disposing of waste meant cities grew even faster. The growth of suburbs and outlying areas forever changed the nature of a city life in the country. In the 1920s, these communities began to grow in earnest as a result of the automobile. During the 1930s, about 17 million people lived in suburban areas. With the exception of a few cities such as New York and Chicago that built subways or other forms of mass transit, most suburban dwellers drove to work each day. This established a pattern that would result decades later in traffic congestion and automobile population, problems that have drastically worsened in the past 2 decades. At the end of World War II in 1945, many veterans returned home, got married, and had children. This is known as the baby boom generation. To reduce the housing shortage, Congress passed the Housing Act of 1949, giving incentives to develop affordable housing. Federal agencies such as the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Authority established lenient lending policies so war vets could qualify to buy homes. Early suburbanization provided many families with affordable housing, good schools and parks, and other amenities not found in the central city. However, the shift away from city centers set up an economic and racial division of interest between cities and suburbs that remains in place today. Although many people in the suburbs still rely on the central city for employment, entertainment, or other activities, suburbanites pay their taxes to their local government and school district. As a result, suburban police and fire departments, schools, libraries, and recreational facilities are usually well funded and well staffed with up to date facilities. Suburbs also have newer infrastructure such as roads, sewers, and water treatment plants, and money to maintain them. In contrast, many central cities have aging and dilapidated schools and typically lack funds for essential government services. Since 1970, cities in the South, Southwest, and West have been considered post industrial cities because their economic production largely consists of information processing or service jobs. Whereas the older Northeast and Midwest cities initially grew up around heavy manufacturing, the newer urban Sunbelt cities have grown through, quote, light industry such as computer software, manufacturing, information processing services such as airline and hotel reservation services, educational complexes, medical centers, convention and entertainment centers, and retail trade centers and shopping malls. Today, edge cities are springing up beyond the central cities and existing suburbs. Initially, edge cities developed as a residential area. Retail establishments and office parks move into the adjacent area, creating an unincorporated edge city. Many businesses and industries move their physical plants to these areas because land is cheaper, workers are better educated, and utility rates and property taxes are lower than in a city. As a result, many jobs move away from the growing proportion of poor minority workers in central cities, creating structural employment. Over time, large scale metropolitan growth produces a megalopolis. A megalopolis is a continuous concentration of two or more cities and their suburbs that have grown until they form an interconnected urban area. What we see here is a model home from the late 1940s and early 1950s, where they were encouraging veterans to come buy the homes in these suburban areas. What we see today are a lot of foreclosures that have occurred in these suburban areas. And a foreclosure is when the bank that has lent the money, takes the loan back and takes the property back as a result of the person who pulled out the mortgage unable to pay for their loans. Back in 2008, 2009, when we had seen our last recession, that's when we saw a lot and a sharp increase in foreclosures because mortgage companies had lent out money to people who couldn't afford to pay for these larger homes with larger loans. When we think about urban problems in the United States, we're going to find that there's several of them, and we're going to be talking about them overall and in a very broad sense. Let's first look at fiscal crises in cities. The largest cities in the United States have faced periodic crises for many years, and some have teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. In the 2010s, the situation has not gotten any better, and some say it's worsened. It's estimated that US cities will soon experience a collective budget shortfall of approximately $60 billion. dollars. Vital services, including police, firefighters, and public works, have been slashed drastically. Some analysts believe that the slashing will continue well into the future. The state of America's cities continue to threaten a long term national economic recovery. Although some cities have been able to retain existing residents and attract new ones, the larger national picture shows that many middle and upper income people reside in the suburbs or in incorporated areas within or adjacent to the larger city. The suburbs and incorporated cities within a city have their own tax base, fire and law enforcement, city government, and other services where residents neither contribute to nor expect assistance from the larger urban center they are near. We're also seeing housing problems. The future of American cities lies in what happens to real estate markets, which has been slow to recover from the massive downturn of 2008 to 2009. When real estate markets are slow and not selling or selling far less than previous years, it's difficult for cities to make up this revenue. The global and US economies will have to improve before there's much hope that city and state budgets will look better. Since the 1980s, the number of low cost housing units has contributed to decreases in the United States. Although there are millions of apartments and houses available for rent or purchase in a variety of price ranges, it does not mean that there is adequate housing available in all price ranges and in all areas of the US. Millions of low cost units have been abandoned. Landlords are most likely to give up their property when caught between increasing property taxes, demands from the city to maintain or upgrade the property to comply with safety standards or building codes, and tenants who demand services but do not pay rent or severely damage the units so that the extensive repair is necessary before another tenant can move in and start paying rent. Abandoned buildings increase fear and isolation in the residents of adjoining properties. The empty building often becomes a hiding place for drug dealers and fugitives or a dangerous place for children to play. In some cities, urban squatters have moved into abandoned apartment buildings and fixed them up. However, most of these projects have been short lived. Developers who recognize the potential in the area demand the buildings be raised to make way for new hotels or office towers. Since the 1970s, some middle and upper class families have re entered central city areas and gentrified properties. Some people view gentrification as the way to revitalize the central city. Others think it further depletes the stock of affordable housing for the poor and pushes low income people out of an area where they previously lived. Gentrification is the process by which people renovate or restore properties in the cities. In most areas of gentrification, they are often white individuals who are building in predominantly persons of colored areas. As a result of housing shortages, cities have instituted programs to provide low cost, owner occupied housing. Some social analysts believe that these programs promote the interests of the housing industry and protect property values rather than actually help people to acquire housing. We need to also talk about the housing meltdown of the 21st century. Early in the 21st century, it became possible for millions of people to purchase houses that cost more than they could repay. Subprime mortgages were made available to many people who did not have sufficient financial resources to purchase a residential property and make monthly payments on it. About 80% of US mortgages issued to subprime borrowers were adjustable rate mortgages, which meant that after initial time periods set out in the loan, the interest rates were reset to a higher interest rate. This caused delinquencies to increase and foreclosures to soar. Historically, banks made and held more home loans with money from local deposits. In the 1980s, lenders began to sell these mortgages to investors on the bond market. Initially, housing prices soared and homeownership reached a high of almost 70% in the US. In 2006, prices began a steep decline, and subprime mortgages and securities backed with mortgages lost most of their value. This was the beginning of the US and global economic crisis and beginning of a downward spiral for homeownership and a sharp uptick in defaults on loans, foreclosures, and bankruptcies. Fannie Mae, also known as the Federal National Mortgage Association, and Freddie Mac, also known as the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, were established by Congress to foster the American dream of homeownership. During the housing crisis, both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapsed, leaving many potential borrowers with no place to secure a loan to purchase a house. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were taken over by the U.S. Treasury Department in 2008 as part of the deal in which the federal government pumped billions of dollars into them to avert an even greater housing meltdown and crisis in the United States. Critics believe that the federal government housing programs have done a better job of providing housing for more affluent people than for the poor. A second criticism has been directed at public housing. Most federal and state public housing projects have been huge high rise constructions that have intensified many problems and created new ones. It's estimated that a total of homeless people in the United States is somewhere between 500,000 and 3.5 million, estimated by advocates for the homeless. It's extremely difficult to count the number of homeless people. However, the US Conference of Mayors conducted an annual survey on urban homelessness in 27 cities, and consistent patterns have emerged. Unemployment most frequently causes homelessness in households with children. Lack of affordable housing, poverty, low paying jobs, and domestic violence were other factors closely associated with homelessness. People of color are overrepresented among the homelessness. Single men make up 51% of the homeless population, families with children 30%, single women 17%, and unaccompanied youth 2%. Families with children are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. Some perspectives on homelessness look at the larger structural issues in society, such as lack of education and jobs. Other perspectives consider the assumption that homelessness is primarily a problem of individuals and how they live their lives. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about racial and ethnic segregation. Problems in housing are closely intertwined with racial and ethnic segregation in the US. Despite passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, segregation between blacks and whites in major metropolitan areas declined only slightly since 1970. According to sociologists Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, no other racial or ethnic group in the history of this country has ever experienced the sustained high levels of residential segregation that Black or African Americans have in central cities. Moreover, residential segregation not only affects living conditions, but it's also associated with other problems. It systemically undermines the social and economic well being of Blacks in the United States. Because of racial segregation, a significant share of Black America is condemned to experience a social environment where poverty and joblessness are the norm. A majority of children are born out of wedlock. Most families are on welfare, educational future prevails, and social and physical deterioration abound. Some analysts argue that residence is a personal choice, and people voluntarily segregate themselves based on who they want to live near. But many people are involuntarily segregated because of certain attributes, such as race, religion, age, or disability, that others devalue. Some landlords, homeowners, and realtors perpetuate residential segregation based on race or ethnicity through a discriminatory practice known as steering, guiding people of color to different neighborhoods than those shown to their white counterparts. Banks sometimes engage in redlining, whereby they refuse to grant loans to people of color for properties in certain areas. The behavior of neighbors can also perpetuate residential segregation. The 2010 census showed that minorities had experienced a higher percentage of growth in the suburbs than in central cities. The persistence of racial segregation in the suburban areas is closely intertwined with growing economic inequality in the United States. What we see here is an example of the homelessness that is continuing to perpetuate our streets, including in Trenton, Philadelphia, and other major cities across the United States. What we see here is a picture of Habitat for Humanity, which is a nonprofit organization that builds homes for low income families. In 1900, only one person in 10 lived in a city. Currently, one person out of two lives in a city. Northern America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Europe, and Oceania are highly urbanized in contrast to Africa and Asia. 21 urban algorithms account for almost 10% of the world's urban population. Rapid global population growth is producing a wide variety of urban problems, including overcrowding, environmental pollution, and the disappearance of farmland. In fact, many cities in developing nations are quickly reaching the point where food, housing, and basic public services are available only to a limited segment of the population. Natural increases in population, like higher birth rates than death rates, account for two-thirds of new urban growth, and rural to urban migration accounts for the rest. While the population is growing rapidly, the amount of available farmland for growing crops to feed people is decreasing. One reason for the high rate of migration from rural areas is that people displace their land, move to cities to find jobs, but farmers leave too. As global urbanization has increased over the past 3 decades, differences in urban areas based on economic development at the national level have become apparent. According to sociologist Emmanuel Wallerstein, nations occupy one of three positions in the global economy. Core nations, like the United States, Japan, and Germany, peripheral nations, like most of Africa and much of Latin America, where the wealthy support the exploitation of poor workers by core nation capitalists in return for maintaining their own wealth and position, and semi peripheral nations, which exploit peripheral nations, just as the core nations exploit both the peripheral and the semi peripheral. According to Wallerstein, it's very difficult for peripheral and semi peripheral nations to ever occupy anything but a marginal position in the class like structure of the world economy due to exploitation by core nations. Social analysts are just beginning to develop comprehensive perspectives on the positions of cities in the contemporary world economy, and not all analysts agree with Wallerstein. What we see here is an example of a post industrial city. So let's look at some sociological perspectives and solutions to urban problems. The functionalist perspectives tends to look at urban problems in three processes that contributed to social disorganization and disruption of social institutions. The first being that mass migration from rural to urban areas during the Industrial Revolution contributed to social disorganization by weakening personal family ties, as well as weakening ties in religion, education, and other institutions. Second, The large-scale immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries were more than cities could absorb, and many individuals were never fully assimilated into the cultural mainstream. Third, mass suburbanization created additional social disorganization, which most central cities have been unable to handle. With larger numbers of strangers living in close proximity in central cities, symptoms of social disorganization, such as high rates of crime, mental illness, and suicide, grew more pronounced. According to Emil Durkheim, urban life changes people's relationships. Rural areas are characterized by mechanical solidarity, whereas urban areas are characterized by organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is social bonds based on shared religious beliefs and a simple division of labor, again, which you'll see more in rural areas. And organic solidarity are special bonds based on the interdependence and an elaborate division of labor, which you see in many urban areas. To alleviate the fiscal crisis facing many cities and level the inequality in services provided in cities and suburbs, sociologist Anthony Oram suggests establishing metropolitan or regional governments. Because problems such as water supply, pollution, and traffic congestion are not confined to one geographic area, they can be dealt with more effectively through metropolitan or regional planning. However, as Orem acknowledges, it's unlikely that officials of cities and suburban municipalities would willingly give up some of their power, and people living in the more affluent suburbs are unlikely to be willing to take on the problems of central cities. Another option for alleviating urban problems is expanding the urban tax base by creating urban enterprise zones. Cities could offer tax incentives for industries to open plants in central cities and provide job training for workers, so a match could be made between jobs and workers. But critics of enterprise zones argue that business tax incentives alone won't improve conditions in central cities. The conflict perspective believes that members of the capitalist class and political elites make far reaching decisions about land use and urban development that benefit some people at the expense of others. Karl Marx suggested that cities are the arenas in which the intertwined processes of class conflict and capital accumulation take place. Class consciousness and workers' revolt were more likely to develop when workers were concentrated in urban areas. Some contemporary conflict theorists speak of the political economy model, believing that both economic and political factors affect patterns of urban growth and decline. Urban growth is influenced by capital investment decisions, power and resources, inequality, class conflict, and government subsidy programs. Members of the capitalist class choose corporate locations, decide on sites for shopping centers and factories, and spread the population that can afford to purchase homes into sprawling suburbs located exactly where the capitalists think they should be located. One of the major results is uneven development, the tendency of some neighborhoods, cities, or regions to grow and prosper while others stagnate and decline. Conflict theorists argue that uneven development reflects inequalities of wealth and power in society. One advantage of the political economy framework is that it can be used to study cities in developing as well as developed nations. Short of major changes in the political economy, most analysts taking a conflict perspective believe urban problems can be reduced only through political activism and organized resistance to oppressive conditions. Some believe that central cities are power kegs of urban unrest that periodically threatens to explode because of massive job loss and economic hardships, racial tensions, allegations of police brutality, court cases, and similar issues. We're seeing a lot of that today as of the recording of this video with the surge of riots and looting and protesting across major cities in the United States. The symbolic interactionist perspectives examine urban problems from the standpoint of people's experiences of urban life and how they subjectively define the reality of city living. According to early German sociologist George Simmel, urban life is so highly stimulating that people have no choice but to become somewhat insensitive to events and individuals around them. Urban residents generally avoid emotional involvement with one another and try to ignore events, including violence and crime that take place nearby. They are wary and view others as strangers. Some people act reserved to cloak deeper feelings of distrust or dislike towards others. Early University of Chicago sociologist Lewis Worth suggested that urbanism is, quote, a way of life, that increases the incidence of both social and personality disorders in individuals. Urbanism refers to the distinctive social and psychological patterns of city life. According to Worth, the size, density, and heterogeneity of urban populations result in an elaborate division of labor and in spatial segregation of people by race, ethnicity, social class, religion, and or lifestyle. The division of labor and spatial segregation produces feelings of alienation, powerlessness, and loneliness. According to sociologist Herbert Gans, personal behavior is shaped by the type of neighborhood a person lives in within the larger urban area. For example, cosmopolites, students, artists, writers, musicians, entertainers, and professionals view the city as a place where they can be close to cultural facilities and people with whom they share common interests. Unmarried people and childless couples live in the city because they want to be close to work and entertainment. Ethnic villagers live in ethnically segregated neighborhoods because they feel most comfortable within their own group. But the deprived and the trapped live in the city because they believe they have no other alternative. I hope that this was helpful for you today. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me via email. Also, don't forget in the description box below is your extra credit question. All you need to do is answer the question in the comments below the video, take a screenshot and upload it for extra credit. And don't forget it's due by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. I hope you have a great day and don't forget to be well and take care.